This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bordone. The two of us are partners at the office and, of course, hosts of this show. And today the topic is, if you are a client and you are hiring a design architect and an executive architect, also known as the architect of record, how do the two work together, and what can I expect each of them to do during each of the phases throughout the project? And that's basically the recording.
That's basically it, yeah. It's that straightforward.
We talk about each of the phases in the process and what each of those architects do, why sometimes the executive architect does more work than the design architect, and why sometimes it's the opposite. We talk about fees a little bit and a bunch of other stuff, and I think you guys are going to enjoy it.
Yeah, I hope so.
Sponsors. If you need to get 2D or 3D as-built of a project, then you should check out Canvas, an iPhone and iPad app. Here's how it works. Using Canvas, you scan the house, and then Canvas processes the scan to produce the as-built automatically, so you don't have to do any measuring. The file formats include ArchiCAD, Revit, AutoCAD, Vectorworks, SketchUp, and others. Canvas has been a great tool for us, and I know many of you will find it helpful, so check them out by visiting canvas.io/SSP, or click the link in our show notes to schedule a demo and get your first as-built for free. Managing projects efficiently is critical to any office, but it can be a challenge. Fortunately, there is a solution, and it is Programma. Programma is a tool that is used by thousands of designers across 75 countries. It allows you to manage all aspects of a project in one place. What does it offer? It has specification schedules, client dashboards, mood boards, product libraries, invoices, purchase orders, and the powerful web clipper, which allows you to save images from the internet and incorporate them into your schedules, pinboards, product library, or image library. Click the link in our show notes to learn more and use the code Second Studio at checkout to save 25% off your annual subscription. This is The Second Studio with myself and Marina. Here we go. So today we're going to talk about if you are a client and you are hiring two separate architects for your project, a design architect and an architect of record, also known as an executive architect, what each of them do and what you can expect throughout the entire design and construction process.
So I think to put things in context before we start, people might be wondering, like, why and when would I need to hire two architects, one for the design and one to be the executive architect, right? And we've done a recording in the past, kind of diving into each of these scenarios in more details, but maybe there is like two main ones that would trigger hiring these two people.
Yeah, the most common reason is that the project is not located where the design architect is. So if we're the design architect and the project is in a different country or sometimes in a different state, then we will employ and use an architect of record or an executive architect to be our boots on the ground, so to speak. The other reason why a client would hire two separate architects is if the design architect maybe doesn't have the capacity to complete the project successfully on their own. So this could mean they don't have the technical expertise that's required. So if you're hiring a design architect because you like their design sensibilities and their creativity, but they've never done a library before, and that makes you nervous, so therefore you would pair them with an executive architect who's done 20 libraries, but maybe they're not the most creative office. Or perhaps there's a very, very tight schedule and there's going to be a lot of production meaning the producing of construction documents, and it has to go at a very fast speed. A small creative office might not have that capacity, and trying to get them to hire new people to meet that capacity is not oftentimes a great idea. So then you would pair them with a much larger office who has that production capacity. So it's fundamentally, anytime the design architect is not able to do the full services to meet the goals of the project. There are cases where, again, that design architect can do the whole thing, but maybe it doesn't make sense. So it would be more efficient to use a local or executive architect. So the executive architect is synonymous with architect of record, and oftentimes they are known as the local architect in the case where the project is not where the design architect is based.
Okay, I think that's pretty clear. Now that we've established why and when, right? Well, actually, when would you need to hire? Do you start with both, or can you start with one and then hire the other one? Like, how does that work?
It's a really good question.
As if I didn't know.
As if you didn't know, right? So you want to start with as many of the core team members as possible for any project, and that's kind of the golden rule to begin with. And that includes these two architects. It includes the structural engineer. It includes the contractor for sure, and some other consultants perhaps. But I mean, really, the architect and contractor are the first two you want to have on board, and then the engineer shortly after, depending on the project. So both ideally at the beginning. Sometimes the client is in a position where they know the AOR, the architect of record they're going to use, but they don't yet have the design architect. And other times it's the inverse. More often it's the inverse. More often the client has found someone they really like and they trust to design something cool for them, but they need to find that other person to bring that other skill set to complete the project.
And I think it's important for clients to hire both of these architects at the same time, because it ultimately ties back into what are each of their responsibilities on the project. And I think it's hard to start a project with only one of them without establishing that list for the get-go.
It's true. So I also want to clarify that for most projects, you don't need two architects, right? That generally speaking, for most projects, you don't need two architects. But the responsibilities of the design architect and the executive architect are very different. Big picture, what it means is that the design architect, as you can imagine, they're in charge of setting the big design vision for the project and designing the project. And the executive or architect or the architect of record, they are responsible for turning that vision into reality when it comes to construction documents and construction administration and permitting. That's really the break. So when you have these two entities working together, all design decisions and oversight happens by the design architect, and the architect of record is really there to help them execute their vision. And it's when you're starting off a project too, with these two architects, it's very clear to have that established and not have people kind of talking over each other. So if you have this two pairing, so like when we've worked as a design architect, it's very important for us that we are paired with an executive architect who is really good at their portion of their work, but also understands the lane that they're supposed to be in. Because as a design architect, the last thing we want is to have the executive architect talking to the client kind of, behind the scenes and saying, I think we should change this and make it red instead of blue, or make this room different size, or change the facade or whatever. That's like the worst. That's like the nightmare for design architects. So
I think for design architect, but also for the clients, because then you hire two people to do to play in two very specific lane, and one of them is starting to play in two lanes. So at some point, you're kind of hiring two people for the same task, which doesn't make sense. So
it also makes me think that another way to describe it is the design architect operates in the why category of things, like big picture thinking and detailed design thinking as well, but the why. And we all know the contractor is responsible for building the thing, right? They're in charge of executing the design. And the executive architect is also in charge of executing the design as it's been described by the design architect. But instead of building the thing, they're in charge of doing the construction documents and the permit drawings and getting permits, and then construction administration. So they are very different things. Obviously, if I'm working with an executive architect, I prefer to work with someone who I also admire for their design skills, because it creates a shorthand kind of communication. I know that they understand what I'm trying to convey in my drawings and in my thinking. It's not that they're going to be pitching ideas to the client on their own, but it means that we can have a much more collaborative process perhaps, or that again, at least there's a shorthand so they get it and they don't do wacky things when they're producing construction drawings that misinterpret really the essence of the design.
So I guess what people might be wondering is how does having these two people work on a project works throughout the different phases and the different step that it takes to put a building together, right?
Yeah. So let's go through all the phases and talk about what these two different architects do. And part of the reason why we're doing this recording is that recently we've had a couple different people, clients and non-architects, ask about these questions, and there's been a lot of confusion as to who does what and how much work takes place, for each of these offices. But so as a quick overview of all the general phases, right, we have concept design, schematic design, design development, permitting, construction documents, and then construction administration, which are the services architects provide during construction. The very first step that takes place is often called pre-design, and pre-design is not broken out as a separate phase, but it's kind of the task that takes place. And pre-design basically means research to make sure that the project is viable. So a feasibility study is what it's often called. And in a feasibility study, you're understanding the zoning constraints, what you're legally allowed to build. And also you might dip into the financial aspect of it. Like if I have $2 million to spend on this project, is that realistically enough money to do it with the square footage and program I have in mind? So all of that would be part of the feasibility study portion. And most often, let's imagine in this hypothetical project that we have a design architect and an executive architect, and the design architect is not local. Again, the most common situation. Well, the design architect is not going to be the one to perform that feasibility study. They're not going to look up zoning codes and regulations. They're not going to know construction prices locally. They're not going to do any of that research. So it's almost like the very first real step made, which is this feasibility study, is done by the executive architect because it wouldn't be done by the design architect.
I mean, I think it could be done by the design architect, but it would take more time. They would probably miss some information or nuances that, because a government website sucks. You're looking for information, it's hard to find. So having someone who has experience and expertise in that specific area is always very valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also really varies depending on the type of project, right? For more sophisticated projects, there would be an expediter potentially who would help with a lot of these kinds of things as well. But all of the, anything technical and regulatory and legal, that falls on the shoulders of the executive architects. They are also the ones at the very beginning to start to begin establishing the core team. So they would be the one to recommend a contractor, an engineer, et cetera, again, because the design architect doesn't have that network, or they don't have that network.
So after gathering all of this information, the pre-design phase is done, basically. So now the design architect can start designing, and that's what we call kind of the concept phase, right? The concept design phase, meaning to say that we have all of the information on the table as far as like zoning, the team, pricing, kind of a rough idea of the rules we have to play by before we can start the game.
Yeah,
so
rough pricing. Like an understanding of how much things will potentially cost.
Yeah, of course. Nobody knows how much it's going to cost until it's been designed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, of course. So the design architect can start his work or her work. It's usually pretty conceptual and pretty schematic. Sometimes it's just, boxy and massing and rough building size and square footage and positioning on the site and things like that. And as those ideas kind of like gets developed a little bit more, the architect of record would also take a look at it to, again, make sure that we are playing within the rules and we're not going too far off of, the research that has been done in the pre-design phase. Yeah,
and one might think that the handing off from one set of responsibilities to another, from the executive architect to the design architect, is very clean and easy. Like, okay, executive architect, you've done all your feasibility study, your zoning research, just hand that off to the design architect, and then we'll contact you a few phases from now when we actually need you for permits or for whatever it is. Most often, it's not quite that clean because the regulations, the zoning regulations and planning regulations, are not as straightforward for complex projects in particular. So there's a good architect understands the code pretty well because it allows you to work between the lines of the code to get to where you want to be. So even in the concept design phase, when the design architect is doing big conceptual massing and talking about views and things like this, they will still talk with the executive architect, and the executive architect will provide, let's say, some level of feasibility oversight. So they can step and say, well, your massing exceeds the allowable height, but I think if we maybe grade the site, which we can do by a certain percentage, we can get it to be lowered to fit, and these kinds of things. So, it's not like you can think about the technical aspects as being completely separate from like the design aspects. The two do overlap quite a bit. I mean, in the span of a couple minutes, you can go back and forth a lot. So even in concept design, there is some collaboration between the two, but concept design is for sure led by the design architect for the most part.
And those conversations are still extremely, conceptual and blurry. So a lot of those things would eventually get worked out as the project gets designed and detailed.
Yeah.
It's, if you imagine you're making a puzzle, like, I don't know, 1,000-piece puzzle, you have 1,000 pieces on the table. Well, you can find the corners. That's fairly easy. You can find the border, fine. And then, it's not going to be a clean process to put it all together. There's going to be like trial, there's going to be pieces that might disappear. There's going to be pieces that won't fit very well, right? It's kind of the same process when you design. It just gets refined and you see it a bit more clearly as you move through it than when you start.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So there might be moments where the design architect is proposing something and the executive architect says, I think we can solve it, but there's maybe half a dozen different ways we could do it, maybe depending on a bunch of other factors. So let's kind of keep in mind this issue, and then I'm sure we can resolve in the future, even if we don't know quite yet because we're not far enough along.
Yeah.
The next phase is the schematic design phase. And the schematic design phase is just one level more refined than concept design. So generally speaking, let's just say that in concept design, we have basic big massing blocks of the rough shape of the building. I'm speaking generally, of course. And then in schematic design, we get much more detailed into floor plans, elevations, and fenestration and things like this. And that phase, again, is still very much led by the design architect because it's a design phase. And the architect of record is there mostly, again, to provide oversight and feedback and input on an as-needed basis. And that's kind of how that phase goes.
Yeah, and that's also probably the phase where slowly but surely the consultants will start pitching in. Mm-hmm. It's great to start with consultants fairly early on, but they also need on their side enough substance in our work to jump in, right? So you need a rough floor plan, you need a rough massing, rough, building footprint, elevations, just so like the structural engineer knows like how far apart are the walls spanning? Like, is there a big opening somewhere? We're going to have a giant window. Yeah. In order for them to start thinking about their portion of the work. So somewhere into schematic design, probably closer to the end of it, middle or end of it, those consultants will be brought on board. And of course, the architect of record will have to be part of this conversation because that ties directly into how the building gets put together and how the architect of records, construction documentation will come along. So it's important for everybody to know what is up and how things are going to work together as early as possible.
And I should say also that the way we work is generally a little bit different from most offices in that we'd like to onboard everybody sooner and have conversations sooner. So the way I would describe it is that maybe more traditionally, there's a tendency for a lot of projects to be run in the manner where you have big chunks of things happening and you complete that before you engage this next person, before you move on to the next phase. So I think the process is in kind of big chunks. Yeah. We kind of like to dice that up into smaller pieces and to engage in, again, dialogue and conversation with more people sooner. So it's not that we're working with all of the consultants and all the professionals the same amount and quantity of work from very beginning to the very end. It's just that them being available so I can call them and say, okay, we have this span. What do you think we would need in terms of structure? Okay, we need this much space. Okay, well, that's going to impact my vision, the design architect's vision for the facade, because now the facade is not this light, spindly thing. We have a big beam in it, or like whatever it would be, right? And it's just, it helps the whole thing runs smoother, and it helps prevent big surprises. As you can imagine, if everyone stays in kind of their focused lane for longer chunks of time and they don't talk to anybody, and then there's a big break to the next point, at that transition, that's when the surprises happen. And that's when the design architect would say, well, I designed this amazing thing and I haven't sent it to the executive architect. I haven't called them in 3 months. And now the AOR has to say, this is like unrealistic. It's not even close to being achievable, especially with the budget, let's say. So allowing everybody to at least be in communication with each other throughout it makes a huge difference. And that tends to be how we approach things.
Okay, so we are approaching the end of schematic design. Everybody's, dipping their toes into the project slowly but surely. Yeah. And now, we got everybody engaged. We have some sort of idea of what the building's going to be, right? Now what's next?
The next phase is design development, and this is where the transition typically starts to take place. So design development is the phase when the schematic design becomes much, much more realistic, and we're starting to think much more technically about the project. in terms of the building systems, so the mechanical systems, the structural systems, energy efficiency, all of these things start to become much more real. Now we're talking about very specific materials, perhaps, and now it becomes more technical. And with that, we're starting to speak with we are now speaking with the consultants much more heavily. So design development is where the handoff starts to take place, where the executive architect is doing a lot more work than they did previously, and it's also where there's much more communication between the executive architect and the design architect, and they're probably conversing a lot more often than they were in the previous phases.
Yeah, I think actually this phase is kind of like a
squishy.
It's a little bit blurry,
yeah,
right? Because it's really when the two architects' work start to overlap in some ways, right? Yeah. I mean, schematic design is oftentimes not pushed far enough in the design that you know what exactly like things are going to look like. Mm-hmm. So therefore you need like an extra few steps to get there, but you also don't want to get too far into it because then you start dipping your toes into construction documents. So it's kind of like a fine line between you know the schematic phase and the construction document phase. Like you have to provide more information to the architect of record to understand like what are the materials, what are the fixtures, what are the layouts, what are the rough details that you're aiming for without necessarily do their work. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where communication is key, and also having conversation with both parties to understand like who is going to provide what and at what point does one's work stop and the other one starts.
Yeah, so you are correct that design development is the phase where it will vary the most between one project and another, depending on the project and the teams. And we're going to talk about also fees, which boils down to how much work each of these different architects are doing. So I would describe, you know, the concept design phase and schematic design phase as being 90% led by the design architect. They're doing 90% of the work, somewhere around there, maybe more, maybe a little bit less, something like that. Design development, it could be that the design architect and the executive architect are doing 50-50, depending on their skill sets and what the agreement is. Mm-hmm. It could be that the executive architect is doing 75% of DD, of design development. It could also be the other way around. It really just depends on everyone's skill sets and comfort level, and again, what they've agreed on. So yes, design development is kind of a weird, it's a phase where the most variation is going to occur between one project and the next. The next phase, though, is permitting and permit drawings. And as you can imagine, the permit drawings are produced by the executive architect because they will be the architect of record. So legally speaking, when someone asks who was the architect of this building, it's the architect of record. It's the executive architect, and they're the ones to produce the permit drawings and compile them with the structural engineer and submit them to the building department to get a building permit. The permitting and permit drawing process, really the design architect has nothing to do in that process. The only level of engagement they would have would be if there is a plan check correction that comes back that impacts the design, and then therefore the executive architect would then have to go to the design architect and say, we got these plan check corrections, this thing they didn't approve, even though they should have, but the plan checkers being a nuisance as they are, so we have to rethink this element. But aside from anything design related, permits has nothing to do with the design architect. So we could say like 90% of that phase is led by the executive architect.
It's interesting too, as a side note, that it could go both ways. Like oftentimes when a building becomes known and there is two architects on it, like a design architect and an architect of record, you oftentimes only know about one of them. You don't know about both of them.
I know.
And I do wish, and it's actually very common, as again a side note, it's very common practice for that pairing and that split of the work to exist and happen on projects. People are not aware of it because it's never mediatized in that sense, but it would be really cool if both of them could have, their names and credits out there, because a project wouldn't happen with either just one of them if it was established to be a two architect type of project.
It's also, this pairing is really, really common in commercial work, much more common. So you'll have a well-known, flashy, architecture office who does, full CDs and construction administration, but maybe for, again, a library or a tower or a museum, if they've ever done a museum that's, 2 million square feet, that the client's thinking, well, I need someone who's done 50 museums before. So this pairing is very common in large scale work and commercial work, definitely. It also makes me think that...
But even for residential, there's a lot of very well-known architects that do work all around the States that use local architects because they are only interested in doing design services. They're not interested in figuring out how to get a permit in Idaho or whatever, right? So they just team up with a local shop that just does that. Yeah,
I think this is true. It also makes me think that for clients, when you're onboarding your team and these two architects, to make sure that you understand what their strengths are and what they've done in the past. So I'm thinking specifically, if you go to an executive architect's website and they have all this work on there, the question is, did you design their work or were you the executive architect only? And the same thing going the other direction too. Because they are, like we've said many times, the architect has to wear half a dozen different hats. And this is one way that these are two very different hats generally, like being able to design something is not the same skill set as being able to produce a set of construction documents and making sure that it gets built, according to those documents. There's actually very different skill sets now that I think about it. Yeah.
So we got permits on the way.
Yeah.
So that was led by the architect of record.
Yeah.
Now the next thing, permits have been approved. Right? Congrats. Yeah, let's go. And maybe before they get approved, you probably would be starting working on construction documents. So construction documents are, again, the drawings that have all of the details about depicting the design of the building for the contractor to understand what it is we're trying to build. Right?
Yeah.
Those are very technical drawings. Oftentimes, it's only the architect of record who will be in charge of those.
Yep.
That doesn't mean that the design architect would not be involved, because it's also very important to get the design architect's eyes on those drawings.
Yes.
Again, they're very technical, and that's how things get put together. So the design architect might want to see how we're detailing that corner, how we're detailing this intersection. There's a transition of material here. How are you approaching that?
Yeah.
Again, to make sure that the design doesn't get compromised or changed, or is feasible. Sometimes you design things, and as you start doing the details of it, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And
there is
a lot of things that comes in one place. Something has to give. Something has to change. And those are interesting conversations, because it's very much kind of going from the concept to reality, and thinking in a little bit of a different way.
Yeah, construction documents is the phase where we are getting ultra realistic. This is as close to reality as we're going to be without constructing the thing. And that's what the CDs are. And the most common mistake that we've seen is clients will hire a design architect, and the design architect will do all of their work, let's say even through design development, and they hand off a design development set to the executive architect, the local architect in this other place, and that's it. They're done. And there's a break. There's a clean break between these two sides. That's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea, because, as one would say, God is in the details. And for a lot of design, its execution and it becoming reality does depend and is made better by the details being what they should be. Sometimes the details are very small things. Other times the details are very visible things. So if I design a building and I have these two planes come together and they're meant to meet and overlap a certain way, and I have an inch gap and it's offset by a foot or whatever, I want that in the design. But it could be that the executive architect, even if they're really good, maybe just didn't quite understand the significance of that. So in the construction detailing, they've shifted that slightly for good reasons, for technical reasons. But design-wise, it wrecks that corner of the building, right? So that's where you definitely want the two to be still talking with each other. And usually what happens is the construction documents will be led by and initiated by the architect of record, and they kind of have to be because they are legally responsible for those documents. But the design architect will have oversight, so they will basically view those sets, redline them, change them to correct things to be what they think it should be. Now, depending on the skill sets and all the different specifics of the project, the design architect might also have a fair amount of technical feedback for the executive architects. And we can talk about that more in a little bit, but that happens also very often. So I've been on projects where, like, I was the design architect, but I'm leading most of the CDs because I had enough experience in that place, in that project type, and I knew there's a way to get to the detail I wanted if we just reconsidered the technical aspects and achieve the technical goals, but in a different way than what the executive architect was doing. So that last point really highlights that it really depends on the pairing and the skill sets of each. But CDs, the big takeaway is make sure that the two are still talking with each other.
Yeah, because the funny thing is, like one could think like, well, like they changed this condition here to make it work in construction, not a big deal. Depending on what it is, maybe yes, it's not a big deal, right? But if that repeats 1,000 times over the whole project, then it starts to be a big deal.
Yeah.
And and I think you also have to understand the value of the services you got from each of those professionals, right? So you hired a design architect for the design, you paid invested money for that vision, that's their expertise, that's what they're bringing to the table. If there isn't that back and forth of communication to resolve things during construction documents, and you just go with, the technical architect, then you're losing value on the design that you've already paid for.
Yeah.
Right. Where there might have been another way to think about it to just enhance that or preserve that. So sometimes I think it makes sense to have the design architect still involved during CDs. It's oftentimes not that much. Like they just take a look at it, mark up a few things, maybe have a few questions, maybe see something that would have an impact somewhere else.
Yeah.
That no one else is seen, and it's not like they're fully engaged like 100% of their time. At this point, they're kind of like consulting on the drawings to make sure things are gonna go where they're supposed to go. Yeah.
So the construction document phase, the workload between the two is very much 90-10, 95-5, something like that. Like the executive architect is doing pretty much all of the work, and construction documents are one of the phases that are underestimated by clients. I mean, CDs, they take an incredible amount of time. It's a lot of ink on the page. It's a lot of detailing. It's a lot of thinking in different dimensions. It's very, very intensive, brain-intensive work, and it's led by the executive architect. Now, the next phase after that, well, there's construction, but actually prior to that, there might be bidding, depending on how the project is run. And bidding means that you are selecting a contractor and potentially getting bids from different contractors. And the person to help vet those different contractors would be mostly the executive architect, because again, they're the boots on the ground that are going to have to work with that architect. But the design architect might also have an opinion, depending on the situation. After that, though, we get into construction, which is the most exciting phase. And in terms of the architect's responsibilities, an architect will provide construction administration services, which means roughly design oversight over the contractor. We are still relying on the contractor to do their job, and they're responsible for executing the building according to the construction documents. But the architect is still very much proactively present and involved in the project, the executive architect, namely by visiting the site on a regular basis, depending on the phase of construction that we're in. And it's to catch any mistakes that might be made during construction. It's also to troubleshoot things that come up, because there are always issues and problems that arise that no one could have anticipated that have to be resolved. And as you can imagine, that aspect, construction administration, is, again, mostly led by the executive architects because they're local or they have the expertise in that building type. So when they step on site, they know what they're looking at. Whereas the design architect, who maybe has not done this building type before or is not familiar with the construction methods in this other country, doesn't know what they're looking at so much when they're on site during construction.
That, and also because the people who did the construction document should always be the one doing construction administration. It's very difficult to imagine that it would be even a different person, like a third party or a consultant that just does that, because who would know best what's been drawn and how things were thought to be put together than the person who did the drawings.
Yeah.
Therefore, when you go on site, you look at something, you have the drawing in your head of that exact thing, and you can think and look at the construction that way. So it absolutely makes sense. It's also the phase where, contractors, would have questions. They would do mock-ups, or they would ask, to come on site to review things or approve things. So you need someone who is super familiar with the project, also has a line of communication with the client and back to the design architect to report if any of those things have a big impact on the project.
Yeah, for sure. So that's the entire process, and that's who does what throughout that. But let's talk real quick about the legal responsibilities and the liabilities of these two different architects. As you can imagine, the executive architect has basically all of the legal liability, and the design architect has little to none, because they're just the designer. And that also is parallel to the liability that they would each carry potentially, right? The executive architect's liable for a lot of things because they are the architect of record, and the design architect is responsible for good design, which is not something that's,
There's no liability on good design. There's no liability insurance on good design.
Not so much. And so one might be wondering, well, what if like it was in the news a while ago where an architect had designed the stadium, a really famous architect, they designed the stadium and they were having problems with leaking or with something. Who's to blame? And everyone wanted to blame the design architect. Truthfully, though, it's not their fault because there was an architect of record, and the architect of record is the one to make sure that it works. And there's also other people too. There's like the waterproofing consultant, the contractor, the engineer, if it was a structural problem, I don't recall. So it's not like one person that's like to blame. But for sure, in that case, it's not the design architects. Like there's another person local who is responsible for making sure all the stuff works. So not to oversimplify, but the design architect's in charge of making something that is programmatically sound, is cool, it works, and looks pretty. That's kind of where the responsibility stops. So that was an interesting that came up because everyone wanted to blame the office. And I remember thinking, but they didn't. They were designer. They didn't. Yeah. They're not responsible for this waterproofing detail. That's someone else that should have done it. The other thing in terms of collaboration and relationships, so I want to note that the design architect is the one who has the most interaction directly with the client between the two architects because they're designing with the client, and the most client interaction happens during concept design, schematic design, and design development. There's not really a lot of client interaction during construction documents because it's highly technical and the design path is very much set at that point. So I have no need as an executive architect to talk with the client about waterproofing details. And construction administration, you'll be conversing with the client again when issues arise, but the bulk of the heavy communication and relationships with the client happens during design, and that happens with the design architects. And with the executive architect, as you can imagine, the bulk of their relationships and their collaborations and communications take place not with the client so much, but with all the other professionals like we mentioned before, mechanical engineer, I was going to say lighting designer, but lighting designer would be working with the design architect as well. But mechanical engineer, structural engineer, contractor, all the big key players that you would have.
We're supported by Enscape. Enscape is a real-time visualization and VR tool that we personally use and recommend. And the reasons why we like it is that it's fast, realistic, and actually easy to use. The interface is great, and they have a good library of components. It also renders in real time, which means that you don't have to waste time waiting for the image to be rendered to see what it's going to look like. It's also a plugin that works with all of the major 3D modeling programs, and it's available for Mac and PC. So if you want to up your visualization and rendering design game, I think you should look into Enscape. So make sure you click on the Enscape 3D link in our show notes for a free trial.
Hey Marina, would you like to get your as-built faster? Of course you would. IPX has you covered. IPX lets you seamlessly transform your laser scans into LOD 300 BIM and CAD files. Whether you've got your 3D scans already or you need the full laser scanning service, IPX offers instant pricing and order tracking for scan-to-BIM services on any project, no matter the size or complexity. Plus, your BIM files can be seamlessly transferred to Autodesk Construction Cloud, allowing your construction team to start work right away. Start your next project on the 50-yard line with accurate data by clicking the IPX link in our show notes and learn more.
The Second Studio podcast is sponsored by Autodesk. And do you know about Autodesk Forma? Available standalone or as part of the AEC Collection software bundle, it's a specialized AI-assisted 3D design tool that can transform early project planning. With Forma, you can rapidly model multiple massing options at the start of projects and analyze the embodied carbon cost of different volumes, layouts, and material choices. You can then deepen your understanding of your sites by incorporating real-world contextual data for daylight, wind, noise, and more. So start your projects right with Autodesk Forma. Check out the link in our show notes to learn more. So the next big thing that people might be wondering is, how does the fee work between these two people?
Yeah.
And one, it's funny because I feel like one would assume, and maybe that gets more into the amount rather than like the load of work, right? But one would assume that if you hire a design architect, you're kind of hiring them for their design sensibilities, like
right.
the aesthetic aspect of a project. Therefore, their fee is going to be higher than the technical guys, right?
Right.
That being said, though,
yeah.
I mean, and it might, depending on who you're hiring. If you're hiring a star architect, then yeah, probably their fee is going to be a lot more than the local shop in Idaho
right.
who's going to do your CDs, right? But in terms of workload, it doesn't really work that way. The architect of record actually is going to produce a lot more work for the project to, go through completion than probably the design architect will. And that also depends, okay, fine, the design architect might go through 30 different design iterations before finding the perfect one, one could argue. But in most cases, like, there is a lot more documentation required for the later phases in the design process rather than the earlier one.
So almost every single architecture firm, when they're submitting a proposal or a contract to a client, there's going to be a chart that lists the phases in one column. And on to the right of that column is another column that lists the percentage of work being done during each phase. And that chart is usually discussing the amount of fee that gets used during each of these phases, which is the same thing as the amount of work taking place during each phase. So it does vary from office to office, but generally the percentages across the phases is roughly the same for most architecture offices. So if you were to just Google search, what are the big, phases in design and construction and how much does an architect get paid by a percentage during each of these phases, you'll find half a dozen charts, and they're all pretty close to being the same. But so talking about it, so let's say we have concept design and schematic design, which sometimes those are sandwiched into one thing and we just call it schematic design. But you have those phases, concept design and schematic design, that's about 23% of the work. Design development, the next phase, is also about 23% of the work-ish. Construction documents might be higher. It's like 35%, something around there. And then construction administration's around 20 to 23. And I forget my math. It might not add up to 100, but somewhere in that ballpark is what the breakdown of workload is. Now, the architect of record is doing basically all of the construction administration, all of the CDs, and half of the design development, maybe more depending on the situation, which means the executive architect is actually doing somewhere between 55 to 75% of the work. So half, but oftentimes more than half of the work is being done by the executive architect. And again, design development is that phase that really varies, but let's assume the design development phase is being heavily led by the executive architect. Then they're doing like about 75% of the work, which is the bulk. And we say this because we've had people say, well, to your point, like the design architect, they've designed the whole project. And all you have to do, executive architect, is the permit drawings and then visit the site every now and then when the contractors who's responsible for building it is doing the heavy lifting during construction. So you're doing permit drawings and these construction documents, which people don't understand what those are, and you're visiting the site, why is it that your fee is higher than the design architect, or that your amount of hours you're going to bill for is higher? Well, that's not true. What that person has asked and what they've asked is based on false information. That's not how buildings happen. And so there is sometimes that misconception of like, they've designed the whole thing, what's left to do? And it's like, most of the work is what's left to do.
Yeah, I mean, having like beautiful 3D renderings, some materials selected, and a floor plan, a couple of facades, it's not enough to build a building.
That's, especially,
again, like 20%
especially
if you're hiring like the whole team and these two architects, it means that you're definitely operating at a certain tier of building.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just like go on site and wing it. You have to have a game plan, and the more detailed your game plan, the better it's going to go. So yeah, no, it's not the terms it's been designed is a little bit like it just shows lack of knowledge and understanding of what it means to design a building. I mean, I think people who've never gone through the process would be surprised to look at a construction document set.
Yeah.
And seeing all the stuff that needs to be listed, thought about, figured out, coordinated, detailed.
Yeah. So a construction document set, how long it takes, it's so hard to give to give numbers of months and things. But for a really nice house, just a house, but a really nice house, the CD portion take 8 months just for the CDs, just for the construction documents, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, 5 months. But on that magnitude, you don't produce CDs for a decently 6,000 square foot house, let's say, in a span of 2 months. It just doesn't. That's not enough time. And again, construction documents is when there's a lot of heavy production and thinking happening. So if it takes an office 6 months to do that, it tells you how much information is going into there. Now, there are times, of course, when so that chart I was describing, the percentage, I'm describing that as the amount of work that takes place generally. The fee oftentimes is proportional, but it might be a little bit different. Again, like you said, if you're hiring a really well-known design architect, then maybe their fee is very disproportional to the amount of hours they actually put into it relative to what the executive architect does. Because you could easily argue that great design is worth $5,000 an hour versus $200 an hour if it has that creativity to it.
I mean,
so that's also true.
It's somewhat goes back to, when you buy, I don't know, a product and the people who actually fabricated it. I mean, if you think about it in construction, right? The guys on site and how much they're making to build the building versus how much the guys who are not on site are paid to design the building or think, right? Yeah. Or like you buy this beautiful watch and the people who are assembling the watch versus the people who came up with the idea of the watch, like...
Yep.
There is different rationale.
So the other example that you brought up as to when the design architect, their fee would be higher than the 23 or 25-ish% that I mentioned is if the design phases take a lot longer. So it's not that as a client, it's not that you're paying them a lot more per hour because of their genius. That might be the case also, but it's also because the design process just takes longer. And most often what that means is that there's more iterations being required. Either the client was requesting it or the design architect likes to do a lot of iterations. Whatever the cause is, it means that instead of producing 3 options, we're producing 20 options. Well, if the design architect is paid hourly, let's say, then the amount you're spending on them is going to go up relative to the typical chart that I mentioned. And that definitely can happen. So, honestly, practicing as a design architect and as an executive architect are very, very different things. The executive architect might be doing more work on paper generally, but that work is also super defined, right? Because we're not designing, we're not having to think about design, we're not having to engage in multiple conversations with the client about various shades of blue on a house. Or whatever color it would be. Like we're just tasked with executing the how, and it's very clear. Which is a nice thing. The design architect, their challenge generally is that design is very vague, and that process is also, we don't know what it's going to be like until we start working with that client. It could be a client where they see something once, or like, yep, that's it, boom, let's go, and they don't go back on their decision, and it's very simple. Other times it does take 20 iterations, which is really uncommon, but at times it does take a lot of iterations. So the design phases can also shrink and balloon greatly depending on the client and on the design architect.
Yeah, and I think the key to a successful pairing is to make sure that I think you want to make sure that both parties that you hire somewhat get along. It's kind of hard to know, right?
Yeah.
But you also want to make sure that they understand what they're hired for and they're okay with that. There's a lot of offices who only are AOR, and that's their business model. That's all they're interested in. They're not interested in multiple conversation about like which is better with the client, right? They just want to accomplish what's been designed, and that's their only goal is that. And those people tends to be great because they're extremely focused and they don't have ego. They're just interested in technical, and you give me that, I give you that, and we get where we need to go. Some offices sometimes do both design and AOR, depending on the projects that they land.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's about making clear responsibilities among all the parties, so there is no confusion or frustration, from one side to the other. If anything, if there is gaps during the process, like if our design architect has more knowledge, like you were mentioning on technical things, like if they could collaborate on that, I think that's the best way to resolve things, rather than getting a little bit feisty or trying to step over people's toes. Like you absolutely do not want that because it's already complicated.
Yeah.
So you want to avoid that.
What you said, that there are some architecture offices and they just act as the executive architect and that's their business. It made me think that, first of all, most architecture offices do both. That just for clients who are new and they're like, do most offices just do one of them? No, most offices do both. Most offices are an architect. An architect does the whole thing
because most architects do everything on their own projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's why.
So that's the majority of folks. But it also made me think that, this pairing of executive architect and design architect is also not that strange, because even within an office, one office that does the whole thing most of the time or all the time, they have technical people and more design people in the office.
Yeah.
Right. And they'll have people that do both. But for the most part, everyone over the course of 10 years or so, an architect, you start to find your path and your groove, what you are better at, what you like more, or maybe what the office needs you to lead because of the staffing that's there. And so you do find people who are, there's generally three different types of folks in an office. There's the technical architect who does like construction documents, construction detailing, coordination with the contractor and all that kind of stuff. There's the designer, and there's a project manager who oversees calendars and personnel and staffing to make sure the project runs smoothly. Those are three different responsibilities to have. So you already have that breakdown within an office. In this case, we're just kind of zooming out and doing it at a slightly different scale, where now it's between two offices instead of being internally. But it also points to the reasoning and the value of making sure that when you have these two architects, that you're not trying to, again, silo them and say, okay, you do all the designing, then you stop, then pass it off to the executive architects, and it's clean break. Because that doesn't work. Imagine you had an office, right? Or in our office, and then we had these three people, a PM, a designer, and a executive architect, technical architect, and we didn't let them talk to each other except for once every 3 months. That would make no sense. The same thinking has to be applied when you have two architects on a project. Now, what would be another reason why a design architect would be doing way more work than just what happens during concept design and schematic design, which again is roughly 23% of the amount of work generally? That would take place if the design architect has experience and knowledge and expertise in that building type already, and maybe also with buildings in that type of climate. But the one thing they don't have is a local presence and familiarity with the local regulations, right?
Right.
So in that case, the executive architect might not need to actually lead the construction document effort. Let me get back to that in a second. And they might not need to be there to help the design architect understand the ins and outs and details of this building type because the design architect already knows that. So in this situation, which we have been in, the role of the executive architect, the only thing that we need is someone that's local to basically just oversee construction or touch base on construction and be our eyes for us. That's all they're needed to be. And in some cases, because we do houses, we don't even need legally an executive architect. We are the architect and we produce the drawings because we're licensed in that state. Or if we're not licensed in that state, maybe that state, because of the project size, doesn't require an architect and you only need an engineer, or sometimes you only need a contractor. So legally speaking, you don't need an architect to do that project. So we end up doing not only the design, but all the CDs and all the stuff that goes with it because we can. So I say that to emphasize that it's the scenario we describe when we talk through all the phases in depth. It's not always applied to everything. It varies depending on the skill sets and the comfort level of the different team members. It also tends to be if you're an architect and you're operating as a design architect for a project, and you are very, very detailed, thorough, and you're used to doing your own projects all the way through, that you're going to have, and as we would, a much tighter hold on the project all the way through. And we're going to be looking at the construction documents very closely, and we're going to have technical feedback on the construction documents as well. And if there is...
Sounds like you're going to be a pain in the butt, right?
I know. If there is an AOR involved in and they know what they're doing, then they're ultimately responsible for the documents and they have final say. Because obviously I'm not going to push them to do something if they say, this is uncomfortable.
No, of course.
There's you have to use common sense. But again, for very design-focused and detailed offices like ours, you tend to be very involved all the way through. So there's cases in the past where technically, I didn't produce the construction documents, but did I? Yeah.
Well, there's examples in the past where our drawings were more detailed than the AOR's drawings.
Yeah,
so
exactly. This is what I'm saying.
That's that.
Yeah.
Which
in
also
which case,
tells you that the pairing wasn't right at the beginning because of that.
Let's think about this 25-75 split in that situation.
Yeah. Now, there is also a scenario where, let's say, the design architect, who's usually like the big star of the show, actually is doing much less than what they're supposed to be, and then the AOR has to step in and kind of like help on that front, which is not cool, because I feel like the design architect is oftentimes the one that's praised for the beautiful work, right? But the thing is, if you gave just a concept design drawing set to your AOR and you're expecting them to detail them, do CDs and like CA and go build a building with that, that's not cool, man. Like, you got to give people information. You got to do your part. So that could be an issue. Sometimes we've seen scenarios where an office doesn't necessarily have a lot of very technical experience, which is not to say it's their fault. Maybe they just need to get to that point, but they get hired for the design or something of a building and get paired with an AOR that has a lot of experience, right? And again, you do...
This sounds like you've been through this before. Well, yes,
because let's say also that sometimes the person who produced the design is not necessarily an architect.
True.
Which is another issue in this topic, where, clients will hire whoever to do the design, hand it off to a technical architect and hope that they're going to figure it out. Yeah. And that design is just white boxes, and that's the elevation. And, that's not design.
So there's a lot to unpack with this. I think one of the big key takeaways for clients when they're thinking about hiring people, if you hire a design architect or a designer and they're producing this design, but they don't care to be involved during DD or CDs or CA, it's a major red flag. Like, what you want is to have two offices where they have knowledge that overlaps. And at the same time, they understand that the responsibilities do not overlap. That's what you want, right? And so if I was a client and I hired a design architect, I want to know that you understand the technical aspects of building, at least generally, and you understand what it means to maneuver around different codes. Even if the codes are different from where you are, I want to know that you know how to think that way when you're designing. And that's not always the case.
But
That's
it's
not always the case.
no, it's not. But it's also, I think, just taking what you've been hired for seriously.
That,
Like it's unfair. It's unfair to me in this scenario because the AOR, they have their liability. Like they are taking things extremely seriously. They're stamping. They're responsible for those drawings. They're going to go through all of the permitting process and applications. So you can't have someone who just steps in, throws the napkin sketch on the table, leaves the room, and good luck, everyone. Like that's just not cool.
Yeah. And so what happens in those situations is one of two things. Either you've hired an executive architect who is good at design, and they're going to have to do a lot of work and a lot of heavy lifting and design interpretation to make the project actually work in the end. Or if you've hired an executive architect who is good technically, but does not have a good design eye, the building will turn out like shit because the details won't be right. And you're going to have flashing that looks bad, but it solved the waterproofing issue. Or you have this detail that solved that technical thing, but it looks horrible. And the average person client might be surprised. Some of the biggest name architects out there, the ones that are in the main headlines, they are horrible to work with as an executive architect. They're not good at understanding the technical aspects of architecture. And it makes it not only makes the job of the executive architect more challenging or gives them more work, it wrecks projects because, again, that gap between these two sides, design and technical execution, let's say, you don't want that gap. And it's really hard to close that gap if you don't have people who know what it means to do both, or at least to overlap significantly. So
it becomes
it's something to be mindful
of.
It
becomes trickier too, I think, in terms of the relationship. Because let's say you are the AOR and you're seeing those like really lightweight drawings, like you kind of have to call out the other person and be like, hey man, like what are you thinking here? Like I need more.
Yeah.
But oftentimes you're being paired through the client. You don't know the other side. You don't want to sound like you're telling them what to do because obviously you've been hired to do two different things. So it just kind of becomes this awkward situation.
So this gets into also a little bit of fee structures. This is where when we're working with a new person, a new architect on one side or the other, a lot of times the hourly fee structure is beneficial, in this case for the executive architect in your example, because they just don't know what's going to be required of them. Now, there's pros and cons to hourly and pros and cons to fixed fee, which is for a different recording. But that's one thing. But what we generally do is, after we have the initial phone call, make sure no one's an asshole. That's step one. Then step two is send me examples of your documents. Send me examples of, and it's for both ways. If I'm the design architect and I'm going to use an AOR, I say send me examples of your CDs, because if they're not up to par with what we typically do, then I know that we're going to have to step in and problem solve stuff, which I'm happy to do, but I just need to know in advance, mostly so I can give the client reasonable expectations of what's going to go down. The inverse is also true, right? If I am who was I a second ago? Oh, yeah, if I'm the executive architect and I'm about to work with design architect and I've not worked with them before, and they say, in that chart I described, okay, we're going to do concept design, we are going to do schematic design, and we're also going to lead the bulk of design development, and then you'll do CDs. I say, send me a couple examples of your concept design, schematic design, and design development sets. The reason why that's really important, as you highlighted, is that for all of these types of documents, right, including construction documents, there's no national metric grading system to determine what the baseline standard should be for good schematic design drawings, good design development drawings, good construction documents. That doesn't exist. So in that scenario, I will get from a design architect schematic designs drawings from this design architect, another set of SD drawings from another design architect, and they're completely different. One could be a vague rendering, like you said, with some general understanding of windows, whitewashed rendering, no materials, no detail, no nothing, and another could be hyper detailed. And if you get further along into design development, the same disparity could take place. And as you can imagine, if I get a napkin sketch, there's a lot of not only a lot of technical work, but a lot of interpretation that has to take place.
We could go 1,000 different routes,
So I guess the thing is for clients, right? If for some reason your architects are not doing what I've described, which they really should be doing, I would if it were me, I would request it. I'd be like, you both send each other documents and know what you're getting into.
I think that's important that they are transparent with how they work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it makes sense for them to share, like their typical drawings or process so they can have visual and understand the other side. You don't want to find that out once you're in the project, because if it's a misfit, then that's not going to go well.
Yeah. It's better for me if I'm working with somebody and they are used to doing full service, but they are interested and willing to not do full service. Because then I know that they understand the whole thing. It's really hard to close the. So I was going to say it's really hard to close that gap I was referring to if they've never done that. The same thing applies to to contractors, right? We most of the time we work with contractors who we select, so it's fine. Sometimes we're paired with a new contractor we've not worked with before, and here's the thing with working with a new contractor. One of the first questions I ask them is, are you used to working with architects, and what kinds of projects have you worked with on architects, and in what capacity did you work with the architect? And they sometimes will say, well, I've worked with an architect. Worked with an architect? When was this? A while ago. Okay, that's a red flag. So if I have a contractor who is eager and interested in working with us, but they don't have a background in working with architects, therefore they don't know how that relationship takes place. They might not understand how communication should go. They might not know how to or be familiar with reading drawings. There's just a lot of stuff they don't know, right? Even if they have good intentions, it's really difficult for me to work with that person, because it's difficult for the client, because there's this gap of information that we're having to educate them on. And that's not a good, somewhat, people have to learn in one way or the other, but for what we do, I prefer not to be paired with someone like that. The same thing applies when I'm working with another architect. I don't want to be paired with someone who has a knowledge gap. I'd rather have there be overlap and have to say, okay, but very clearly, you're not doing this on this project, and everyone agrees to that. That's the best.
The contractor thing. How many times did people say they work with architects and then you find out they actually didn't?
Well, you gotta vet them and ask them in what capacity, and slowly figure out.
But it's not always. And there's some sneaky people out there. The other thing I was going to say, when you are a design architect working with an architect of record, and those architects of record typically do full service on their projects, but in this case they're okay with just being the AOR.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to, and you never know how things are going to go, but it's important to make sure that they're okay of letting go of that part.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's tricky, right? Like when you care about what you do, and you're used to do everything yourself on the project, not to do some of those things, or seeing that maybe you would do better than that other side that's been hired to do it, and basically knowing your place.
Yeah.
Could be.
It's true. And this goes back to, I think, a recording we did recently where architects, especially design-oriented ones, tend to have a little bit of ego, or let's say pride in what they do. This isn't also to say that the executive architect cannot propose any design ideas. They can, absolutely, but only in closed conversations and directly with the design architect. If I'm the designer, I do not want the executive architect to be proposing design ideas in a joint meeting with the client, and I've not heard of these ideas before. That's, like I said in another recording, it's a cardinal sin for contractors to propose anything regarding design, and contractors know this. The same thing happens when you're working with an AOR and a design architect. The AOR, they know, it's not my territory. I might think this a shade of color, or we should tweak this room layout. I will propose that. I'll maybe mention that to the design architect if I feel like they're receptive to it, but I'm never going to do that in front of the client. And that's something too, on occasion we're reached out to by other architects who want to know if we would work with them in an executive architect capacity. And it's like, yep, done that before. We'll do it again with the right people and all that other stuff. for various reasons. And the first thing I tell them is I understand very well my responsibility and my role. If you want my input, I surely can give it to you, but I will only give it to you. I will not give it to the client ever. Like that's your job. You're the designer, you know.
Yeah, and it's not really about, getting brownie points with the clients. Like, it's not about who's going to look best to the eyes of the client. It's not a competition. It's a teamwork. So it's very much, the relationship should be about preserving the other side and make sure you're there to support them and not step over them.
Yeah.
So, that lesson right there.
Okay. Okay.
No, but you know how it goes. I mean, it's also hard because sometimes those relationships don't work as well as you were anticipating, or something goes wrong somewhere, or someone in the team, because offices are not just one person, and sometimes you have 5 people on one end, 4 people on one end, and there is an asshole here and 2 assholes there.
Right.
And like that person just ruined the thing. So it's a lot of people and things to manage. So
it is, and that's where setting realistic expectations and knowing how it's going to go and everyone's skill sets at the beginning is very, very clear.
All right, so what are the key takeaway from this conversation?
Key takeaways: the scenarios in which you would need both or 2 architects. Basically, it's when the design architect is not able to do all of it is when you would need them. What they do during each of the phases, the design architect does most of the work during the design phases, and as one would imagine, and then it transitions to the executive architect doing most of the work for the technical portions, such as permitting and construction documents and construction administration. Legally speaking, the executive architect carries all of the legal responsibility and liability. The design architect's almost none in a certain sense, and the amount of work that is done by each of them, generally the actual amount of work, like hours, is more with the executive architect, with some exceptions. And the exceptions take place really depending on the client, but also depending on the skill sets of those two. So sometimes you'll have a design architect who is quite capable to do most of the technical aspects, but maybe they're just not licensed in that state, or they're not local to the project, so they just need a set of local eyes and ears. In other cases, maybe the design architect can do some really cool watercolor drawings, but they don't have any capacity beyond that, which would require the executive architect to, hopefully, if they have a good design background, do a lot more of the heavy lifting and actually do a lot of the designing to complete the design. But in either case, if you're a client, make sure you know who you're working with, and make sure that you have those 2 architects share documents so they can actually see behind the scenes what they're capable of doing rather than just stating it.
Great. Thanks for the key takeaways.
They're good, right?
They're amazing. Tasty.
All right, give me an outro.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this show. If you like,
what are you laughing about?
If you like what we do, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, everywhere you can. You can find us on Instagram, Second Studio Pod. That is also the website, secondstudiopod.com. We have the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can call, leave a voicemail. If you have any questions, any guests you want to see on the show, any topics you want us to talk about, that's probably one of the best ways to reach out. And what else?
You can find our office. Our office is out there. It's FAME Architecture and Design. We have a website. We have an Instagram. We have everything else that's out there as well. Many more great episodes to come. Any questions, hit us up. Appreciate you guys listening. Talk soon. Bye.